Hey, everybody, and welcome back to World History. So today we are talking about and starting our final unit of first semester. So we'll be covering the Middle Ages up until the point where the Renaissance and Reformation are starting, which we will pick up with when we come back in January. So today we are doing the first two sections of Chapter 7. So you're going to complete about half of that fill-in-the-blank packet today. There is an assignment when you are finished, and that is the reflection on learning assignment. So let's go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. All right. So we've kind of alluded to this before, but after the collapse of Rome, especially in Western Europe, they entered into a period known as the Dark Ages. There was a lot of political, social, and economic decline. They were politically divided. Most people transitioned out of the major cities and back to the rural areas, and they became cut off from the advanced civilizations of the Middle East, China, and India. They also faced constant invasion, trade slowed down, towns were emptied, and education pretty much stopped. If you remember back to our ancient Greece unit, a lot of those Hellenistic age accomplishments that we talked about, this is the time period in history where they were lost. Okay, so the Middle Ages is roughly 500 to 1500 years, so we're covering about 1,000 years of history in this unit. It's also referred to as the medieval age, or which is the Latin term for Middle Age in terms of their culture. And it's where we start to see a change from ancient times to modern times as well. So first thing we have to talk about is the Germanic kingdoms, which are based mostly up here. Now, at this point in history, Germany does not exist as a country yet. We're still well over 1,000 years away from that. Germany at this point was just various Germanic tribes that had conquered ancient Rome, people like the Goths, the Vandals, the Saxons, and then the Franks. The Franks would eventually become your French, and then the Saxons would eventually become part of Britain. You have the Goths, which were mostly over here, that made most of the cultures that we see today in like Spain and Italy and those sorts of things. Their cultures were very different from the Romans. They were primarily agricultural-based, farmers and herders. There was no cities, no written laws, as we've talked about in other civilizations. They typically lived in smaller communities, and a lot of their customs were unwritten. And typically, they were ruled over by a tribal council of elected kings that essentially just maintained the day-to-day stuff. So let's talk about France for a second. So King Clovis, at the age of 15, conquered Gaul, which was the Roman name for the land that would eventually become France. He would convert France to Christianity and find a powerful ally in the Pope. So another thing we have to talk about is the Muslim empire and the Muslims being centered in what we would consider today Spain. Now, it's important to note that Islam began in Arabia in the 600s, and it is a new civilization. And part of their expansion overran places like Palestine, parts of northern Africa, and made it all the way to Spain. This alarmed the church and Christian kingdoms. A lot of them saw Islam as a direct conflict-driven group to Christianity. That's why later on this unit we'll talk about some conflicts between Christianity and Islam. That's actually the Islamic Center of America in Dearborn, Michigan. So let's talk about a battle between the French and the and the Muslims. So the Battle of Tours. A Muslim army crossed into France thinking, you know what, we're going to expand. Nobody stopped us. Let's go. They were stopped by Charles Martel, son of Pippin the Middle, who rallied the Frankish troops. Christian warriors won this battle really well, and to them, they believed it was a sign that God was on their side. They did stop the Muslim advance into Western Europe, and it was a turning point because it marked the beginning of the end of Muslim domination in parts of Europe. So we have to talk about Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He's the grandson of Charles Martel, the King of France. He did briefly unite Western Europe, mainly what would become France, Germany, and a part of Italy, into a new empire of sorts. He's also referred to as Charles the Great. Now, Charlemagne reigned for almost 50 years, which is a pretty long time for most kings of this period in history. Spent much of that time fighting other groups, mainly specifically the Muslims in Spain, the Saxons in the north, the Avars and the Slavs in the east, and the Lombards in Italy. Essentially, Charlemagne reunited the Western Roman Empire. Even though it had been gone and dead for a while, he brought it back. Okay. So Pope Leo III had actually asked for help versus rebelling nobles in Rome, and Charlemagne actually sent people to help. He sent people to arrest the opponents of Pope Leo, and as a result, Charlemagne was proclaimed Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day of 800, essentially becoming the new Roman Emperor. So the Christian Pope named a German king the successor of Rome, and this outraged the people in Constantinople. Remember, at the end of the Roman Empire, they broke into the Eastern and Western Roman Empires. Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, this divide began to grow between the two Romes and the Christian worlds. They essentially were starting to get really angry with each other because they were realizing, you know what, no, you can't come back and have that power. This is something that we had for ourselves. You can't have it. Now, Charlemagne actually desired a unified Christian Europe and wanted to help spread Christianity. So he worked closely with the church and appointed powerful nobles to rule over local regions. At this point in history, it was still the expectation you practice whatever religion your local noble preached. Now, also with it, even though we don't talk about education as much, there was a revival of learning. Education was designed to bring unity. Charlemagne could read but not write, so a lot of people had to write accurate records for him and write clear reports. Local schools were established and brought many of the best scholars in Europe to the palace school to teach him. So Charlemagne's legacy. He extended the Christian civilization into Northern Europe, and a lot of his culture that we see becomes a blending of Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions. And he also makes a very strong, efficient government. It's something that massively influences the rest of the Middle Ages. Okay, so after Charlemagne died, Louis I took over, and eventually, when Louis died, his sons would battle for power at the treaty, and then the Treaty of Verdun would resolve that. And Charlemagne's grandsons essentially would split the empire into 3 regions, including one led by Charles II, the Bald. So Charlemagne's successors actually had faced many threats and invasions after his death. The Muslim forces posed a major threat. They actually conquered the island of Sicily, which became a thriving center for Muslim culture. Another group we have to focus on is the Magyars. They were nomadic, they settled in Hungary, and they began to plunder Germany and parts of France and Italy as well. They very much just took whatever they needed for themselves. Next up, we've got the Vikings. So, native to Scandinavia, they broke the last threads of Charlemagne's empire. They were mostly independent farmers. They ruled by landowning chieftains. They were expert sailors and raiders, traders, and explorers. They actually set up the first colony in North America and trade routes that linked Northern Europe to the Mediterranean lands. So that is it for the first section. So we're moving on to section 2, folks. Feudalism. Now, you may remember we've discussed feudalism before, but a lot of it developed in Europe due to people needing protection. And it was a loosely organized system of rule based on mutual obligation. Powerful local lords provided their land among lesser lords, and then these lesser lords would give the land to vassals who pledged service and loyalty, and they would sign a feudal contract. The lord granted a vassal a fief, or estate. Typically, those were acres or hundreds of square miles, and typically would include lots of peasants, towns, and or buildings as well. Here's a great way to break down the structure of feudalism. So again, at the top, you have your king, then you have your lords or vassals to the kings, your knights who are vassals to the lords, and then everybody else. So this point in history, we're very much at the period of knights and nobles and all that great stuff. Warfare was a way of life for medieval nobles. It was common. If somebody ticked you off, you went to war with them. These rival lords then battled for power, and you had these knights or mounted warriors that were sent to his father's lord's castle, and they rode horses and fight with each other. They keep armor and weapons in good condition. Laziness was typically punished, and discipline was extremely strict. And once you reached a certain age or a certain point of your training, you were dubbed a knight in a public ceremony. So, some warfare stuff. Knights loved to fight on horseback. They had their own armor. They used shields. Weapons were traditionally swords, axes, and lances. And they would have a number of tournaments or mock battles to show off their skills to the public. So in the 1100s, when we talk about castles and defenses, this is really where we start to think of like the true like medieval castles. They owned very large ones with high walls, towers, drawbridges, and moats. Knights would defend the castle and typically lived in the castle, and sometimes peasants would take refuge inside during an attack. During war, it was very important that the castle itself was not attacked. It was under the beliefs of war at the time. If the castle fell to the opposing enemy, you lost. It's done. It's over. Women during this time played a much more active role. The lady of the manor would supervise the vassals, manage the household, perform some agricultural tasks and medical tasks. However, they weren't able to really inherit land and were really only in charge of household management. One of the big ideas to come out of this area is chivalry, or romance in reality, a knight's code of conduct, essentially meaning they'll be brave, loyal, true, fight fairly. This did not apply to commoners and was meant to protect the weak. Now, you also had troubadours or wandering musicians that would create epic stories of brave knights and their devotion to their ladies. This is the whole period of time where people would be like, "Here, sir, take my hanky as a sign of my affection," and all that stuff. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So manors typically were the lord's estate. They were the heart of the local economy. One or more villages and surrounding lands were built on it, and each of these manors were self-sufficient. They produced almost everything they needed. They provided housing. There was typically a mill, a church, and a lot of farmland. And the population was made up of serfs, mostly peasants. They were not slaves, but they weren't free either. They were bound to the land. Remember we talked about that earlier on this year. So, when it came down to it, there's a lot of mutual obligations. The peasants would farm the land, repair roads, bridges, and fences, and then pay to stay with produce. They needed permission from the local lord in order to marry or leave the land. The lord would then allow peasants to farm a small piece of land for themselves and protect them from whatever may happen. Now, life for the peasants. It was pretty harsh. You worked from sunup to sundown. Disease was extremely common. Average life expectancy, you were lucky to make it past 35. And they did celebrate life with things like marriages, dancing, sport. Every year they'd get a week off at Christmas and another week off for Easter. All right, that is it for notes for today. You are now going to access the reflection on learning assignment on Google Classroom. I will see you all next time. Bye, everyone.